"No offense, but you wouldn't last a day in basic," my daughter's fiancé said at the dinner table, laughing as he said it, gesturing toward me with his fork in a way that was clearly meant as harmless ribbing rather than genuine insult. The table laughed along with him, my daughter included, and I smiled and let it pass, because correcting a young man's joke at his own engagement dinner wasn't a hill I felt any need to die on that particular evening. My name is First Sergeant Robert Callahan, United States Army, retired. I was 64 years old the night my future son-in-law suggested I couldn't handle basic training, and I let the comment sit there, unchallenged, for reasons that had less to do with pride and more to do with simply not wanting to make an engagement dinner about me. I need to back up and explain who I actually was during my career, because the gap between that dinner table joke and the reality of my service is wider than most people would guess, looking at a quiet, gray-haired retiree who spends most of his time now fishing and doing crossword puzzles. I spent 29 years in the Army, the final 11 of which I served as a senior drill sergeant and eventually as a training instructor at one of the Army's premier non-commissioned officer academies, responsible for developing and delivering leadership and tactical training to soldiers being groomed for increasingly senior instructor and command roles themselves. It's a specific, demanding kind of work, less about combat directly and more about shaping the people who would go on to train and lead others, a role that requires its own particular blend of toughness and precision that doesn't always show up obviously in a person's day-to-day demeanor decades later. I developed a particular teaching philosophy over those 11 years, one built around the idea that you couldn't simply drill discipline into young soldiers through volume and repetition alone, that lasting instructors needed to understand the reasoning behind every standard they enforced well enough to explain it, adapt it, and eventually teach it to someone else entirely. I was known among the instructor cadre I worked alongside for a particular exacting standard, demanding not just correct performance but genuine understanding, a distinction that separated soldiers who could follow instructions from soldiers who could eventually train others themselves. I trained literally thousands of soldiers across those 11 years, watched many of them go on to distinguished careers of their own, occasionally crossing paths with former students years later in ways that reminded me, quietly and privately, that the work had mattered even if I rarely thought about it in dramatic terms myself. My daughter, Rachel, grew up mostly during the later, more stable years of my career, once I'd transitioned into the instructor role and stopped deploying regularly. She had, I think, a reasonably accurate general sense that I'd been a drill sergeant, the kind of detail that gets flattened over years of ordinary family life into a mild personality quirk, explaining why I made my bed with hospital corners or why I still woke up at 5 in the morning out of habit decades after retirement, rather than something she thought about with any real depth or specificity. I retired 9 years ago and settled into the unremarkable rhythms of civilian retirement, the fishing, the crossword puzzles, the Sunday dinners with Rachel, and eventually her fiancé, a sharp, likable young man named Kevin, who worked as a physical therapist and had, notably, never served in the military himself, though he'd mentioned once or twice an interest in some of his clients' military backgrounds, the kind of casual curiosity common among people who work adjacent to that world without direct experience of it themselves. Kevin's jokes about my supposed inability to handle military service weren't malicious, and I want to be fair about that up front. They came from a place of genuine unfamiliarity rather than disrespect, the kind of good-natured ribbing young men sometimes direct at older, quieter figures without fully considering what might actually be underneath that quiet exterior. I'd become, over years of retirement, exactly the kind of unassuming older man who invites this particular category of joke, soft-spoken, patient with his grandchildren-to-be, more likely to discuss fishing lures than anything resembling his actual military history. There's a certain irony in it that I found privately amusing more often than genuinely irritating, the specific comedy of a man who spent over a decade training other people to be tough, being gently teased for supposedly lacking that same toughness himself.
The engagement dinner comment was the third or fourth variation of this joke I'd absorbed over the roughly 2 years Kevin and Rachel had been dating, each one slightly different but following the same basic shape: gentle skepticism about whether the mild-mannered older man in front of him could have possibly handled anything as demanding as actual military service. I'd let each one pass without correction, partly out of the same instinct that had kept me quiet about my career for years, and partly, I'll admit, because there was something almost amusing about being so thoroughly underestimated by someone who had no idea what he was actually looking at. What changed the dynamic wasn't anything I did directly. It was, instead, a conversation that happened almost entirely independent of me, between Kevin and his own physical therapy career path, several months after that engagement dinner.
Kevin had decided, somewhat unexpectedly, to pursue a specialized additional certification that required him to complete an intensive training program taught by a small cohort of instructors, several of whom had military backgrounds themselves, given the physically demanding, injury prevention-focused nature of the certification. His primary instructor for this program was a man named Master Sergeant, now civilian instructor, named Curtis Boyle, a serious, exacting teacher who Kevin mentioned frequently over the months of his training, often with a specific kind of respectful intimidation in his voice that I recognized immediately, having inspired similar reactions in students myself for over a decade. It was during one of the later sessions of this certification program, according to what Kevin told me afterward, that the subject of military training backgrounds came up among the small cohort of students, prompted by another participant asking Curtis Boyle directly about his own military instructor history. Boyle, apparently, mentioned, almost in passing, the name of the non-commissioned officer academy where he'd received his own foundational instructor training decades earlier, along with a brief mention of a particular senior instructor who'd shaped his entire approach to teaching, someone Boyle described, according to Kevin, as the toughest, most exacting instructor I ever had, the standard I still measure myself against. Kevin told me later that something about the way Boyle described this instructor, small, specific details about his teaching methods, certain phrases he apparently used to correct students, nagged at Kevin's memory throughout the rest of that session, though he couldn't immediately place why it felt familiar. It was on the drive home that evening, Kevin told me, that the pieces finally clicked together. Boyle had mentioned, in describing this formative instructor, a specific and somewhat unusual phrase about building soldiers from the ground up, not just training them, language that Kevin realized with a jolt he'd heard before, from me, at a family barbecue years earlier, when I had made an offhand comment about how I used to train new soldiers, a comment Kevin had absorbed at the time without any particular significance attached to it. Kevin called me that same evening, his voice noticeably different than his usual easy, joking tone, and asked me directly whether I'd served as an instructor at the specific academy Boyle had mentioned, during roughly the time frame Boyle would have gone through his own training there. I confirmed that I had, genuinely unsure at that point what exactly Kevin was working toward with the question. He explained, somewhat breathlessly, that he'd spent the entire drive home turning the memory over in his mind, second-guessing himself, wondering if he was simply imagining a connection that didn't actually exist, the kind of coincidence that seems significant in the moment but falls apart under closer examination. He told me he'd almost talked himself out of calling it all, worried he'd sound ridiculous suggesting his mild-mannered, fishing-obsessed future father-in-law might be the legendary figure his own instructor still references with something approaching reverence. What followed was Kevin explaining with a kind of dawning disbelief in his voice the conversation he'd just had with his own certification instructor, the specific details Boyle had shared about his own formative training experience,
and the growing suspicion, which Kevin asked me to help him confirm, that the legendary, exacting instructor his own current teacher still measured himself against decades later might actually be sitting across from him at Sunday dinner every week, discussing fishing lures. I asked Kevin for a few more specific details, dates, unit designations, the kind of information that would let me actually confirm rather than simply guess at the connection. And within a few minutes of comparing notes, it became clear that yes, Curtis Boyle had indeed been one of my students, a young, promising soldier who'd gone through my instructor development program during one of my final years in that role, before I'd retired and largely lost track of where my various former students had ended up. Kevin was quiet on the phone for a long moment after we confirmed this, and then he said something that stuck with me. An apology that wasn't dramatic or overwrought, just genuinely embarrassed for the wouldn't-last-a-day jokes he'd been making for 2 years without any real information behind them. I told him honestly that I understood why he'd made those jokes, that I present, by design and by long habit, as exactly the kind of unassuming figure who invites that particular brand of gentle skepticism, and that I'd never given him any real reason to think otherwise, having deliberately kept that entire chapter of my life folded away during our Sunday dinners together. Kevin asked if he could bring Curtis Boyle by sometime, half joking, but also, I could tell, genuinely wanting to witness the moment his own exacting instructor came face to face with the man Boyle apparently still described decades later as the toughest standard he'd ever been measured against. That meeting happened about 3 weeks later, and I want to describe it honestly rather than dramatically. It wasn't some cinematic reunion. Boyle, older now himself, graying at the temples, recognized me almost immediately, and there was a long moment where neither of us quite knew what to say. Decades of separate lives suddenly collapsing back into the specific, particular relationship of instructor and student that neither of us had expected to revisit at a Sunday family dinner. Boyle, I learned that afternoon, had gone on to a full career of his own after leaving the Army, eventually transitioning into civilian training work himself, teaching not soldiers but physical therapists and athletic trainers, carrying forward, in his own words, the exact teaching philosophy I'd drilled into him decades earlier, without ever fully realizing how directly he was passing it along to an entirely new generation of students in an entirely different field. He told Kevin and Rachel stories about my old training methods that I'd genuinely forgotten myself, small specific techniques and phrases that had apparently stuck with him for over 2 decades, shaping how he approached every student he'd taught since.
We talked for hours that afternoon, Boyle telling stories about his own career that I'd had no idea about, having lost track of him, as instructors often do, once a soldier moves on from training into whatever path their career eventually takes. Kevin sat mostly quiet through much of it, visibly recalibrating his understanding of the quiet, fishing-obsessed older man he'd been gently mocking for 2 years. Rachel, watching all of this unfold, told me afterward that she'd learned more about my actual career in that single afternoon than in her entire life leading up to it, admitting somewhat sheepishly that she'd absorbed the same flattened, mild version of my history that Kevin had, simply because neither of us had ever pushed the conversation deeper than the comfortable surface we'd both settled into over the years. She told me she'd always known in an abstract way that I'd been a drill sergeant, but watching Boyle describe the actual weight and specificity of what that had meant, decades later, still shaping how an entirely different professional field trained its own newcomers, had made the label suddenly feel real in a way it never quite had before. The joke stopped after that, not because Kevin felt embarrassed into silence, but because something had genuinely shifted in how he understood me, replaced not by intimidation exactly, but by a specific, informed respect that felt different from the vague, generic, thank you for your service politeness most people default to. He still teases me occasionally about the fishing lures, but the wouldn't-last-a-day jokes never came back, replaced instead by genuine questions, the kind that come from someone who finally understands there's real substance worth asking about. If you've ever been underestimated by people who simply never had reason to look closer, I hope you hear this. Being quietly overlooked isn't always a wound that needs correcting immediately. Sometimes the truth finds its own patient way to the surface, arriving through the most unexpected channels: a former student's memory, a chance conversation, a phrase repeated decades later without either party realizing the connection until exactly the right moment brings it home.